The ITU is a United Nations specialized agency for the ICT and telecommunications. And our main focus is development of international standards for telecommunications and ICTs. So at our level, we had a focus group on digital financial services, and that was the first time that I came to the CPTM. That was back in 2015, to present the work of the digital focus group, the focus group on digital financial services, which was looking at the, what are the issues that developing countries face to scale up usage and to scale up adoption of mobile financial services. So following this focus group, which actually completed its work in 2016, we came up with a number of best practices and also international guidelines, all of which are accessible on the ITU website. And we now have what we call a financial inclusion global initiative spearheaded jointly by the ITU, the World Bank, and the Bank for International Settlements, looking at the implementation of the recommendations from the focus group and also the recommendations from the report of the World Bank on payment aspects for financial inclusion at a country level. And to support the country implementation, we have 3 working groups that have been set up, which are developing guidelines and also helping the country implementation. And we organize every year an annual symposium called the FIGI, for Financial Inclusion Global Initiative. The FIGI Symposium, which is held every year. The previous edition was held in India last year, and the next edition will be held in January 2019 in India. So by the time we finished the work on the focus group on digital financial services, there was an interesting proposition that came to the ITU about studying the landscape for digital currency. That came in last year, in 2017. And we set up a focus group on digital currency, including digital fiat currency, which had its first meeting in October 2017 in China. This focus group is chaired by someone from eCurrency, and we have as vice chairs the former governor from the Central Bank of Kenya, Professor Ndungu, and then the People's Bank of China director of the Institute of Digital Currency. He's another vice chair. And then we have as vice chairs the NTRA from Egypt and the Ministry of Communications from India. So this focus group regroups both regulators and platform providers. So it has central banks, telecom regulators, as well as platform providers for digital currency and also digital fiat currency. So the next meeting of this focus group is going to take place next month, 18th to 20th of July, and it's being hosted by the Cornell University in New York. And the focus group is expected to have another 2 meetings next year to wrap up the work. And I must say that at the meeting in New York, we'll have a presentation of use cases from a number of central banks, for example, Bank of Sweden, the Central Bank of Norway. Central Bank of Norway. There's also the Bank of Philippines, Central Bank of India, and also the Central Bank of Brazil. So, in the focus group, they are studying, for example, the question of what we consider digital fiat currency. So if we take a look back at what happened previously, in the past, everything was set against gold. The gold was the primary medium for exchange. And then in the US, for example, you had a number of private banknotes that came up. So each state was printing its own currency. And then the Fed Reserve came in and said, this is a very costly mechanism. So instead of each state printing its own currency, and then there's a problem of finding out, okay, what's the exact value of each currency against each other. So the central bank came forward and said, okay, I'll buy off all the previous currency notes that you have, and I'll issue the dollar. And this is going to be the sovereign currency for the US. Okay? And that's how we have what we call central bank currency came forward. And now we fast forward. What we have nowadays is a similar situation coming up, where you have a number of private e-money coming out on the market. Okay? And people have a number of choice, for dealing on these e-money services. And we are running into a situation where, okay, we might need to unify these things, okay, and this is where maybe a central bank could also issue its own currency to unify all these private e-money services. So the digital fiat currency, what we're looking at is, we're looking at it first of all from the economic perspective. So what would be the economic impacts and benefit of introducing a digital fiat currency over mobile money? Identify use cases, requirements of central banks and applications of digital fiat currency. Come up with a reference architecture, which is like the platform, what kind of architecture is needed for deploying digital fiat currency. I mean, we've talked a lot about blockchains, but there are also other platforms other than blockchains that can be implemented to support a digital fiat currency. What are the security issues? Okay, we talk a bit about security, but we have to bear in mind also that blockchain also has a number of security issues. Okay, for example, the encryption that's used on blockchain can be circumvented using quantum computers or quantum technologies, which is not far down the road. Okay, so there will be a need for coming up with encryption technologies that are quantum safe in the future. So we're also looking at these security issues. We are also coming up with a way forward for standardization roadmap for digital fiat currency technology architecture. So that's the main objectives of the focus group. In terms of the work within the focus group, we have 3 working groups. So one focusing on the regulatory requirements and the economic aspects of digital fiat currency, which is actually led by Professor Ndungu, former governor of Central Bank of Kenya, and also the NTRA from Egypt. So they are studying the legal aspects. Okay, what are the legal requirements for a country to be able to, for a central bank to be able to issue its own digital currency, and also look at what has been done in other countries. So at the workshop, we'll have basically 3 countries talking about their experiences. There's the Central Bank of Sweden, People Banks of China, and the Central Bank of Philippines, sharing what they have been doing in this field. And then we also have the Bank for International Settlements and the European Central Bank presenting a paper on the taxonomy and definition of terms for central bank issued digital currency. The reference architecture working group is looking at the interoperability scenarios for digital fiat currency implementation. So we're looking here more at implementation and deployment. How do we deploy digital fiat currency? Like I said, there are 2 options. One is a centralized architecture, and the other one is a decentralized one using the DLT. So how do we implement both? What are the pros, what are the cons of each scenario, and then what are the interoperability issues? So these are the questions that are being studied here. And then of course there's the use cases, how it can be implemented and for what purpose and what's the economic benefits. We're even looking at, in terms of electrical requirements for a country, if you're going to, if you want to go on a decentralized path, the mining and so on, what is this going to be in terms of power implications for a country? The third working group is looking at security issues. So we're looking at what are the different threats and vulnerabilities in the existing underlying infrastructure. So for looking at things like, like you have in the physical world, like counterfeiting, for example, or money. So if you're moving your currency in the digital world, you must ensure that these cannot be counterfeited. That's a very important issue. There's another issue of AML, anti-money laundering. So if central bank is going to issue their own digital fiat currency, people are going to make use of these for payments. What are the AML implications? What are the KYC requirements? So these are the things that are being studied here in the security working group. And then by putting in place a digital fiat currency model, the central bank will have, we talk a bit about data, data visualization. It's possible with a digital fiat currency model for the central bank to have the information in real time where the money is flowing. So you don't have to wait for you to get reports. There are data visualization tools that can give you the information in real time. So we're looking at the use cases for big data analytics in digital fiat currency implementation. So that's a bit, a very quickly like overview of the 3 working groups and the work that's taking place here. So we invite, of course, anyone who's interested. These groups are open for participation. There's no restriction in terms of who can participate in the work. And if you're interested to know more, you can contact me after the meeting. So for the upcoming meeting in New York, we'll be finalizing the use cases. So where we are at now, so we'll be finalizing the use cases, the study on economic impacts, and also the definition of terms and taxonomy. And we'll have a first draft of security architecture. Okay, so these are, this is one slide to say, in which area we're looking for contributions. So the focus group is contribution driven. So we invite contributions from, all stakeholders. And these contributions should be sent to the focus group secretariat. You have the email on the website. And once we receive your contribution, we get in touch with you normally to see how we can, move the work to the different working groups. Okay, so this is some information about, links to the focus group. Okay.
Just a bit louder.
Yeah.
Just a bit louder. The mic is on.
Okay. Yeah. So I'm saying this slide. This slide shows some links to the focus group website where you can access all the meeting documents. However, for you to have access, you would need to register. So you would have to do some registration. All the information are available on the website. So, like I said, so we are looking at the use cases. So what's the next step? Okay, I think you heard what are the monetary and policy implications before, but what we are looking at the level of the ITU is in terms of implementation, really. How do you get it out rolling on the ground? What are the technology architecture options? What are the pros and the cons? What are the security implications and how you address them? Okay, so I think I'll stop there, and then if you have any questions, I'll take them.
Well, no, Vijay, thank you very much for, we are kind of, as you know, again, broadcasting live to those who are joining us, and probably a number of your colleagues that you're working with. But Mike, before you come in, and those who are in the digital emerging group, one of the reasons why I appreciate it very much for International Telecommunication Union, particularly your division, and Malcolm, the Deputy Secretary General, is very keen for us to be together, is because in the financial inclusion with the central bank governors and so on, we rarely involve private sector from telecom and the telecom as such. And there are private sector in the digital industry and so on, but not necessarily. So the issue is how distinctive is what you do and connect it with what the governors in each country does. Yeah, you know, what is the connection between the ITU work on this focus groups and the national context where the governors, yeah, are trying to emerge some kind of national frameworks where these issues of uncertainty and so on to do with cryptocurrency, digital fiat are being discussed. Yeah, how do you come in at the national level, in other words?
Yes, I think what we do at our level is more we create a platform for collaboration among different countries. So, for example, at the focus group meeting, you'll hear also about how other countries, like for example developed countries, are tackling the issue of digital fiat currency, but also developing countries like for example the Philippines and India, and although India is not really a developing country, but you'll also hear also about some of the middle emerging economies like India, China, also how they are actually implementing digital fiat currency. And this is a platform where you can meet people who are, you know, actually involved in the implementation part, get the information that maybe you need at your level in terms of policy or maybe in terms of implementation as well. And you get also to meet the providers. Okay, in fact, ITU is probably a unique group in terms of standards development, because we bring together different stakeholder groups. We bring together regulators, we bring together the providers, and we also bring together international organizations as well around the same table. So I think this is probably a platform where you get to share and meet people who have expertise. Yeah, I'm talking about a knowledge sharing group. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Thank you. I appreciate the presentation. I just wanted to check a very small thing. I was under the impression that part of the reasons we are seeing this change, the coming in of whether it's cryptocurrency, blockchain, it's a move away from having one organization that controls the currency and everything. Now, if you are moving to digital, that will be done, digital currency, that will be done by the central banks. How do you ensure it's acceptable to those that were introducing the new things because they were moving away from this? This is why I was saying earlier, when it kind of started, I was under the impression they were saying, these are the anti-establishments. They want something different. Now, if we go back to what you're proposing, is you're working on, you're getting back to the central banks. Will that be acceptable? How do you ensure they don't come up with something else as well?
Thank you. I think in the previous session, I mean, we heard like I think he's not here, but he said cryptocurrencies is not a currency. Yeah. So, I mean, what we're talking here is a digital currency. It's a central bank issued digital currency. It's issued by the central bank, okay, using the same monetary policy committee that you have. You know, whenever you need to print money, decision is taken, and then the process is engaged. Yeah. So here it would be again, it's a central bank that issues the digital currency. It goes to the commercial bank. So there is a process of issuance, distribution that comes into play. With regards to other currencies that are, for example, like bitcoins or the other ones, the other cryptocurrencies, these are mined independently. Okay, it doesn't fall under the central bank right now because these are private stuff. So I think at some point the central bank will have to take a decision. Sorry?
Are you suggesting central banks, any central bank? Which one? Which one? Which
Yeah, like
central
for
bank?
example, the dollar, instead of a paper dollar, it will be an e-dollar, but it's in digital form.
Oh, this is a hypothetical.
It's not a hypothetical, but it's a real value dollar. Instead of it being printed, it's in digital form. It's a token, and it's already happening. You have it in Sweden coming
Dollar.
out. Krona. It's in Sweden. They use kronas.
Yes, not dollar.
Yeah.
So, yeah, they're looking at e-krona. It hasn't happened yet, but I mean, it's no. I think we're getting a. I just want to make one comment. An intervention here. It's like really, is the euro physical currency when only 1 in 10 euros is printed? So, yeah, I think we have to think about it that way. Is the euro a physical currency if only 1 in 10 euros is printed? So everyone says, does Europe have a digital currency? I would say, yeah, it was probably called quantitative easing. That was our digital currency. We just didn't know it. Yeah, so, yeah, nothing's really physical in our financial world. So the digital fiat currency, it's pretty much here. It's just the citizens don't know it yet. That's what's happening in Sweden. It's not that we have an e-krona, it's just that they're not telling us that they don't really want us to use cash. So sorry to interrupt, that's fine.
Adam, do you have some question?
My understanding was that there are central banks that are issuing digital currency. That's from him. The question is, if there are central banks that are issuing digital currencies, how do they work with the normal fiat currency? So what is the interface? If there is any central bank that has issued that digital currency, how do they work with the other fiat money?
So right now they are still experimenting. So these use cases, they are experimentations that are taking place. Okay, so there's not something like real life example. These are still experimentation. But in terms of issuing a digital fiat currency, you will need to keep, there are different implementations, but one implementation would be to keep, you'll need to have a digital wallet for the e-currency so that the person will have two basically accounts. One is linked to the DFC, the other one is a normal bank account, which is linked to the current banking process.
I just wanted to say, I understand from discussions that actually Uruguay has a pilot on issuing digital currency, and they are working with. I'm trying to remember the name of these guys who were giving us the plates for printing money. I can't remember the Italian company. I'm forgetting the name. They're working on that, and they have a pilot which they think will work. But my challenge, in my thinking always, I'm always saying to myself, how will that be different from what we're doing now with mobile phones, technology, and so forth? Because that's all digital. So I don't know whether, and then also, how do you cater to the public? Because with cash, you know that you use commercial banks to get money to the public. This one, how do you get it? When I sit in the central bank and I print a digital dollar, how do I get that to the phone of a woman in the village? So for me, that's always a challenge.
Anyway, I suppose the focus group deals with many processes.
To answer your question, you're using the commercial banks to circulate the money, and that's probably the same way it's going to happen.
Valuable because of the big private sector. Who are they involved in? You show there, but can you mention people who are not people, but companies that are?
Well, we have the.
Of course, they have.
I mentioned the central banks, but then there is also platform providers. There's R3. There's global platform. There's e-currency as well, who is involved. There's also the Gates Foundation. They have their own open source platform called Moja Loop as well. Yeah. I mean, there's a good mix of platform providers and also central banks as well, and telecom regulators.
Thank you very much. That completes the. Yes.
So the ISO is also, for example, the security working group that I showed before. They are the ISO is participating in that working group.
If only ITU, ISO, group of governors, central banks were to be together outside the focus group, which is more, that would be something very useful.
You should join the meeting in New York.
Yeah.
If you try that one.
Yeah. Okay.
If you invite her and possibly myself will come. Thank you very much. Can I ask Mihaela to come take us through the next one?
Well, I think the only thing that I wanted to point out now, I think I have something here, is that it looks like we are actually jumping from one topic to another. And I was talking with Adam and our colleagues. The thing is that it's quite difficult to maintain the same pattern of what anybody is following, with the exception that there was the idea that in the morning, after the financial inclusion review, we kind of approach various signals which may not be connected to start with in relation to digital landscape. And there were the various issues that and various people who came in, including the most recent preoccupation real time of most of the governors and most of the countries on the legal frameworks. So that is what happened in the morning, but wouldn't have been, and we had economists whom you've seen what they think about it, and they are most representative, some of the best ones, and wouldn't have been finished that particular cluster of issues unless we would have had something to do with the focus group that ITU is following in the last few years, which is very valuable, particularly from the point of view of the telecom involvement and so on. So I suppose the first part of the think tanking is over, but that doesn't mean we are not continuing the issues to do with the digital and so on impact, but the governors are obviously quite preoccupied of the impact on the data and the statistics. And we had in the morning, we brought in the issues of visualization for all sorts of reasons, including issues related to how you visualize Bitcoin itself, in addition to what the Bank of England mentioned to us. And I think it's proper for this afternoon's kind of discussion around data and statistics and the impact it makes on new type of statistics, the nature of statistics which are being offered to the central banks and to the national economies. To start with, probably again, the way one communicates these issues related to data and new statistics. So we have Alan Smith, who will be who is boss within national statistics, but he will explain actually. And we will have the very new, newly established again research center on the nature of statistics, new type of statistics, Rebecca. And we'll have the leading figure from the National Statistic Office itself, Jonathan Athau. And finally, we will have also an input on what is it require digital infrastructure, just simply as a beginning of a discussion for next think tanking from Guelph, from Manchester. And as an overall, Professor David Hand, who is very well known in the data sciences and who introduced us to data as such, will be giving us the latest on that. I think he's just coming now. So that is what is happening in the next 1 hour and a half. Okay? Okay.
You just talk each other in your brain.
We just talked in the brain and he's here. But David, yeah, he's here. You will be here. So I suppose, Professor Mutabila, here is Alan and Rebecca, and then probably Jonathan Athau, and then, yeah?
Well, okay. Let's move on to the new
Yeah.
subject.
Yeah.
And
It is,
in accordance with the order that
yeah, that to make sense of what we're watching. So is okay. We just talked about you, David,
David,
and
welcome.
he said that, how is it that I knew you're coming? Please, welcome. Welcome.
Welcome.
Yeah. Yeah, please.
And your name is by the seat. So good. Great. So good afternoon, everybody. I'm really pleased to be here, and I was so interested to hear all of this talk about technology, and then I worried that I'm not going to talk about technology enough, because you can hear plenty of people talk about the technology of data visualization, and it always makes me think of the American inventor Danny Hillis's definition of technology, which is that it's everything that doesn't work properly yet. And so I think it's an incredibly risky venture to hang your whole philosophy on that. So I want to talk a little bit about, like, you heard from Lindsay this morning, who is the Bank of England's first data visualization editor. And I'm the Financial Times' first data visualization editor, so there is clearly something in the water, right? Why is this happening? Why are these very old and revered institutions in central government and in the media, financial reporting, deciding that data visualization is a thing that's worth investing in? So I thought what I will do is, rather than talk about technology, I'm going to talk about a very loose strategy behind why we're doing this. And I'm defining strategy as the patterns in the decisions you make. There is nothing complex in this strategy other than the repeated things that are making us do what we do. I've been at the Financial Times for 3 years. Before then, I was at the National Statistics Office for 15 years. So I have some experience of both central government and the media. And I think the thing, more than anything else, that people now, when they see data visualization and they think about how it might work in their own organizations, one of the things that they really want to achieve is impact, right? Like, I want to make the communication layer of our business meaningful. I want it to create impact, And in central government space, for example, working in the statistics office, what that meant was we wanted to stimulate debate, right? Like we wanted to encourage people to take data, turn it into information, and then reason what that means for the decision-making processes in the country. At the Financial Times, we want to do something similar. We want our readers to understand what's happening in the world and to have their own debates about what it means for their own lives. And so soon after I joined the FT, somebody came to me and said, "Hey, Alan, I'm doing some work with Pew Research Centre." Sorry? 3 years ago. 3 years ago.
How did National Statistics Office allow you?
I escaped in a tunnel. I dug a tunnel and I escaped. This is it. So in the first month, somebody came to see me and said, "Hey, Alan, we're doing some really interesting work with Pew Research Centre, who are looking at how the US income distribution has changed in the last few decades." They said, "We have some inflation-adjusted household income data, and we want to know how to visualize this data in the story." And I said, "Well, you know, this is an income distribution, so we'll create a histogram of this data." I said, "And the only difference that we're going to really do with it, so we have household income, poor households, rich households. This is the shape of the distribution in 1971. This is how it worked." So you can see the US definition of middle class is purely based on income. And so what I'm about to do is run this as an animation. So we want to see how has the income distribution changed over time. So we run this line to preserve the outline of 1971. I don't know if you can see this. And it's a very short animation, but it does make you look at the data, right? Like you kind of think, well, there is a very different shape to this income distribution. The story that we wrote about was about this flattening of the traditional middle class sector, and actually the very interesting reaction in income distribution terms either side of the financial crisis. So it was designed to be a conversation starter. What does this changing shape, this shape-shifting distribution mean? And for me, this is a really good example of the power of visualization, because when you go back to your hotels tonight, when you return home in a week, visuals tap into memory. That's one of the things they're very, very good at. So you won't remember the numbers, but you will certainly remember the changing shape of the distribution, right? It's a very, very powerful visual argument. So in the story, I said this animation has to be right at the start of the story. Here is the graphic on which the rest of the writing will remain. And the graphic became very popular. And I'm going to show you what happened in terms of impact of this graphic. The first thing, and I was a new journalist, right? So I didn't know what the rules of journalism were. I didn't know that the Los Angeles Times could take my graphic and write their own article about my graphic, which at the time this was published was when Bernie Sanders and Hillary Clinton were in the Democratic primaries, Democratic nomination. And that seems like a long time ago, but it's not really. And so it brought this graphic to a whole new audience by being in virtue of the Los Angeles Times. And in fact, because one of the big discussions between Bernie Sanders and Hillary Clinton was income inequality, this graphic turned into a big debate. Bernie Sanders took it and put it on his Facebook page. And my son is a big Bernie Sanders fan, and he thought this was the best thing his dad had ever done, was that his graphic was on Bernie's page. But if you look here, the engagement level in terms of debate, of people actually sharing the graphic and talking about the interpretation, because the graphic is actually quite ambiguous. It doesn't say, look at this terrible story or look at this lovely story. It's inviting people to interpret it and understand it and so on. And most recently, this thing keeps coming back to me. People keep writing to me and say, you did the animated histogram, right? because I'm seeing it everywhere. And most recently, the North Korean foreign minister tweeted it at Donald Trump. And I will let you read the tweet yourself. I won't read that tweet out. This whole exercise for me was an example of how the graphic can perform the narrative much more convincingly in some ways than the words that might accompany an article. So for me, at the FT, I said, right, you know, this is what we want to be doing. We want to be creating graphics that create impact, not to be sensationalist, but to actually get people talking about what does this mean for them. The second sort of principle is that actually my graphic was relatively conventional, right? So actually, it wasn't the craziest graphic that you'd ever seen. It was just a histogram. And one of the things I like is that actually it's really important in your strategy for data visualization to remember why charts exist at all. And for all of you here today, it's so important to realize that they were invented to solve the problem of communicating financial information. That's why they exist at all. There's some people at the Royal Statistical Society who champion the cause of Florence Nightingale's graphics. And she was great. She was a pioneer, but she wasn't the first. The first was this person who wrote these words, and I am amazed that these words are over 200 years old. As knowledge increases amongst mankind and transactions multiply, it becomes more and more desirable to abbreviate and facilitate the modes of conveying information from one person to another and from one individual to many, right? That is a sentence about big data that was written in 1801. The person who wrote this, I'm going to reveal his name, don't worry, looked at the world he was living in, which was the classic Enlightenment period in Western Europe. He looked at how this fascination with empirical data, what impact was it having on how we communicated? And I love this because this is from a Royal Statistical Society journal. This is continued from page 390 of volume 18, and this is volume 19, right? Like so, this is compiled from the Bankers magazine. This is how you present numbers. And my mystery inventor wrote about this and said, nothing is more dry and tedious than this, right? Like, this is boring and it's difficult.
You're saying then statistics.
Yeah, so this was what people assumed statistics looked like, right? And our mystery person said, unless you set your mind and imagination to work, mind and imagination is what's required. And the person we are talking about was William Playfair, who wrote the Commercial and Political Atlas in 1801, and he actually invented bar charts, line graphs, pie charts in 1786. No, he's not. But he is part of a Playfair family that was very influential in the Enlightenment period. His uncle was the architect Playfair in Edinburgh. Playfair himself was an apprentice to the engineer James Watt. These were very influential people in the Enlightenment. Playfair ended up being one of the people who stormed the Bastille in Paris, actually. He was in the middle of all these events. But what his mind and imagination led him to do was this. This is the first time we'd ever presented information visually like this. And what he realized was, as well as it is being a beautiful thing, and I still think this is more beautiful than most of the charts I see today, what he said was, this is not just beautiful for beauty's sake. He said, yes, you're going to get it all, right?
Because actually, before you know it, in Lesotho, like
Yeah.
Ben Sanders.
Yeah. So Playfair wrote about why these graphics work, and these words are still relevant to what you're trying to do today. Remember, this is big data, 18th century style. What he said was, proportion, progression, and quantity in one act of memory. That's why you can remember the income distribution. All of those numbers, one act of memory to remember how it worked. And so, luckily, at the Financial Times, we realised that this was a really important way to present financial information, so we ignored it for 70 years. Right? And in fact, it was in 1955 that we bothered to put a fairly simple chart on the front page. And then once we discovered graphics, we realised we could have a lot of fun with graphics. And it took us down a very terrible road. This is what not to do with graphics. This is what happens when you worry that your data might be boring, that your reader has the attention span of a fly, right? Like, you know, this is not a good form for your strategy, to think that the graphics are there to just break up the text or to, you know, a little bit of light relief. So instead, and this was 1999, this was not too long ago at the FT. So instead, what I want to do with our strategy is to focus on what we call graphicacy. And that is people's ability to interpret visual information. Because one of the things that we probably all learn at school or college is how to read a pie chart, a line chart, or a bar chart. Now you don't have to remind yourself how to do it because it's a part of your vocabulary. But my big argument is, why does the vocabulary stop at 3 types of graphic? Right? Like, there is a range of different types of graphic that we can use now, and they are optimized for telling different types of stories with data. So we have developed at the FT something called the visual vocabulary. This is the FT's visual vocabulary. This is our visual thesaurus for how to present data, and it is designed to educate both our journalists and our readers about how to interpret data in visual form in a way that conveys insight and understanding. And so the way that it works is that it identifies elements of the data that you really want to emphasize. Am I interested in the flow of funds or the flow of migrants? Well, then have a look at the different types of options here. Am I interested in spatial or part to whole or deviation? So it's based on the relationship in the numbers that you want to exploit. We've had it translated into Chinese, Japanese, and you can get your own copy of it just by typing in that web address. And what we advise people to do is put it on the wall. It's a big poster, put it on the wall and make people socialize around it, right? Like, data should not be a solitary activity, right? Like, these things should end up being collaborative and interdisciplinary. So I'm going to show you some examples. I hope that our colleague from this morning gets on well at the Wall Street Journal today. He won't tell them about this front page from the Wall Street Journal. This is what happened when the Dow Jones hit 20,000 in January 2017. They put a big chart on the front page of the Dow Jones from 1896 through to 2018. And I took this chart because I use it in my teaching. I say this is a bad chart. It hides the story. The chart, this is the chart that the Wall Street Journal make. And you can tell from the title why I think it's a bad chart. Right? What Great Depression? Here's the Wall Street crash. Right? And that's because with big, long indices, a linear scale's a terrible thing to use. Because what you're interested in is the rate of doubling. 1,000 to 2,000 is the same jump as 10,000 to 20,000. So you should use a log scale, and then the Wall Street crash really comes out. It took 25 years for the index to recover to that same level. And notice here it's under the carpet, right? Like, we have hidden it completely. And more recent events here look exaggerated. Okay? Now they look in context. That's the financial crisis. That's the Wall Street crash. So that's one transformation that's good, but there's still a problem here. You know that every single one of these oscillations is something. It's an economic event of some magnitude, right? Like, it's like an earthquake monitor for economies, right? In this form, we can't understand it. We can pick one story, but what about all the rest? So this is where our visual vocabulary allows us to pick a new kind of form. So this is change over time. We want to show the Dow Jones over time. The standard way to do it is this line chart, but there are other ways to do it, and one of which is to change the orientation and make it a vertical timeline. And so now this is time running in this direction. I have the date, I have the president, and every single US recession is now on the graphic. And as I just scroll down the graphic, there's the Wall Street crash. There's the financial crisis by comparison. And so we have a completely different structure for the presentation. Here's one from one of our banking correspondents. Alan, I want to make a map that shows which city is set to take over from London as the post-Brexit banking centre, right? I have this data on which bank is in which city and the level of coverage that it has. Is it got a bank or just a branch? And she said, I also want to show which banks are most federated across Europe. So I want to see which cities are strong and which banks are strong in geographical location. So I'm going to ask you to solve the problem. Which city is strong? From the map, tell me which city looks strong. Can you do that? You can kind of see that maybe Frankfurt is stronger than Lisbon, right? You can see that. What about JP Morgan? How well is JP Morgan established across Europe? You can't see it, right? You can't see that because remember Playfair's words, one act of memory. I can't answer that question like that. So with our visual vocabulary, we transformed it into this. It doesn't matter about the distance between Paris and Luxembourg. The geography is irrelevant. What we're really interested in seeing is strong cities and weak cities. That's the columns. Strong banks and weak banks. Right? Like, so it's a matrix, a heat map based on cities and banks. How about visualizing things like the bailout? One of the things we were interested to know was how big was the bailout? And what proportion of each country's economy was the bailout, the size of the bailout? So that's another type of chart that we can do called a Marimekko, named after the Finnish textile company. So here, this axis shows us for each country the proportion of GDP that was the size of the bailout. So this is 100%, 0%. And the shaded area shows how much of the bailout has been recovered to date. The vertical axis shows us the size of the economy. So we start with the small economies, Cyprus, Slovenia, Greece and Ireland, and you can see Greece and Ireland, we have a big proportion of the economy that's in, you know, the size of the bailout for the country, but we're still talking relatively small. So what we decided to do was to stretch the graphic again, and the story quickly becomes clear, which is the size of the US economy and the fact that it's the only one of those countries which actually recovered more than the size of the bailout, that it broke the thing. Using the graphic means you can also, making the graphic big means you can also bring some of the story directly onto the data. What happened here, right? So that's what we do at the FT. That's our strategy. Put it on the wall, get people to talk about what are they really trying to show and what are they trying to communicate. One of the things that I've had to spend a lot of time telling people is you should get rid of the idea that a chart has to be understood in 5 seconds. Some people say to me, Alan, that's a terrible graphic. I can't read it in 5 seconds. And so in return, I say, well, I hate your article because there's too many words in it. Could you just summarize it into a tweet for me? Right? 140 characters or less, because I haven't got time for the thing. Right? Some graphics require you to read them in the same way that they do words. And I have an example here. Here is a 5-second chart. It's the vote share in the 2012 presidential election. Okay? It's 5 seconds because you can see that Hollande got a lot of the vote, Bayrou didn't. Right? It's a bar chart. It's very simple. 5 seconds. Here's another chart. This is the vote share in the 2017 presidential election. I can see that Macron won most of the share, but not as much as Hollande in the 5 years before. I can see Hamon and Mélenchon were down at this end. They're simple charts. They take 5 seconds to read because there's 5 seconds of information in it. What about if we had richer information that told us more about the relationship between these elections? So what happened to the people who voted for Hollande in 2017? That's when we can go to a new type of chart called a Sankey. And so we still have the 2 bar charts, the 5-second bar charts are here. That's 2012, and this is 2017. But now, what we're saying is, look at the proportion of Hollande's voters who went on to vote for Macron, and look how half of them then split down to Mélenchon and Hamon. Compare it with Le Pen, and you can see how incredibly loyal her vote was. Right? Like I said, we're visualizing a matrix now of voter flows between different elections. Now that's not 5 seconds. Which chart would you rather get information from? Right? Rich works when the data's rich. Make people read it. Once they've learned how to read this kind of Sankey diagram, then the next time you see one, just like a pie chart, you know how to read it. Right? You've got to educate yourself first on how to do it. And that's why we do a lot of this now. On our visual vocabulary, with quite complex data, we're saying spend some time learning how to read it, and look, we explain to people, how do I read this? Because you will be rewarded. There will be a payoff to the reader for some insight. Who else does this really well in the banking sphere? Well, my favourite, and something that you can go and see right away, is the World Bank. Their Atlas of Sustainable Development Goals is first rate, first class. You can get hold of a copy of the PDF on the web. It's full of graphics that do that sort of job. So loan disbursements, gender gaps, income. This one's interesting. This is deaths by age and sex, low income, middle income, high income. Really powerful graphics. Right? Notice that the words are just as important as the graphics. So you need to be able to write well and communicate well. Yeah, so that's pretty much all I wanted to show, except the last thing you should make central to your strategy is to learn more from the FT. So I write a monthly column in the FT, in the work and career section, on, it's called the Chart Doctor, right? Like where every month I take apart a graphic and do something with it and show people how to design it. We ran a reader event in January. We did like a day-long workshop, so there's like training that we're starting to explore. And I shared this with Mihaela before, but there's a TED talk that I did on how to get people to appreciate and love statistics. Okay, that's kind of one of the things we really want to do, so that they don't think it's dry and tedious, right? It's rewarding. Yeah? Okay. Thank you.
Any questions or comments?
Comments. Thank you, Alan.
No questions. Professor Yamika.
No, yeah. And
No questions.
Governor has.
Governor.
Where is it? Sorry. Governor, wait, some just.
Thank you very much. It's really, really entertaining. But I was just wondering, because it looks like the graphs are becoming more and more complicated, so that you need an explanation to understand the graph. So if I need that, why don't I just read the words and move on?
Can you remember? That's exactly why I referred you at the start to Playfair. What the words cannot reinforce is progression, quantity, and proportion in one visual impression. But good graphics need good words. Okay? My graphics team now are trained to write as well as to make graphics, because titles and annotations as an explanation of how to interpret the graph are really important. And although I deliberately showed you some more complex graphics here, because the data required it to be quite complex. We, you know, visualizing matrix flows of mergers and acquisitions and the voter flows, that requires it. But it shouldn't be over complex. So to visualize the income distribution, just a bar chart, right? Like just, so we don't want it to be too complex. The distinction for me is between clarity and simplicity. You should always be clear. Simplicity sometimes involves removing information, like the election chart, the bar charts. There's information removed to make it simple. But I'd like you to write the words that described the flow of voters, because that's more difficult. Yeah.
Your Excellencies, let me just appreciate the insightful presentation that I have just listened to, and also make a note that this is in collaboration with what Lindsay had done. It looks like they are the same, and I would request the presenter to give it to us electronically. I used to consider myself as a lazy person because my listening span is very short. I read newspapers almost every time when we have newspapers in my country. They bring a pile of newspapers to my office, but I never read them. I just scan, because as I said, I considered myself as a lazy man. Then today, because of the two presentations, I'm not a lazy man. But
I thought you were inviting Alan to Marcel.
yes, I think it's best when you go to South Africa, just go via my place and we talk graphics, because the massive information can be interpreted in a very small diagram but make sense. So really, I'm so impressed about the two presentations, and I believe that I will share with my colleagues and see how we can do massive data into small graphics and make sense about it and make proper decisions, because it has been outlined that you have information because of the data compressed into small amounts so that at least you can make proper decisions. Because in a number of developmental programs, you find that people dwell much on the information without actually reaching the final stage of decision, where actually could bring about some financial prospects. I mean, you find that because of bureaucracy in some stages, to apply for a loan to a certain bank, it becomes a very long process, and sometimes you even forget, why did I ask the money for? So, so really, I'm quite impressed, and I don't have questions except to request you to deliver the presentation to us. I will give you my email address and see whether the information that I've gathered here can go and help my country.
Minister, we are saying about is a kind of data literacy that we That's what, yeah.
One of the conversations I had at lunch was to say that thank you for your very kind comments, that one of the problems here is that in education, this kind of graphical literacy, it's very easy to avoid developing it. Yeah. So, and it's very difficult to encourage it as a form of communication between different types of people. So economists know how to draw Lorenz curves and Laffer curves on the back of napkins to give to other economists. They're not so skilled at how to communicate necessarily with people who are not economists. And similarly, people who are designers, the graphics people, they're artists generally, who have spent their entire career avoiding numbers, right? Like they have an arts degree, not a science degree, and and this divide is problematic. And so the graphical literacy, as Mihaela says, is incredibly important. The other point connected to this, because I think it goes to the other question as well, is the interesting contrast for me to go from the central government to the Financial Times is that the change of business model is that now the strategy has to support a commercial operation. So I can't indulge myself in saying, I just want to play with things that I'm lucky that the government allows me to do what I want to do. My content has to actively reinforce the business, that people buy the newspaper, they subscribe to the website, and we have clear evidence that things like the income animation attract and keep the readers on the FT. So it's a really important thing to be able to do. Yeah, exactly, yeah.
Yes, thank you very much. I should add my appreciation to your teach our graphics in this style. So I very appreciate the way you have presented it. It's an emerging way of teaching it. We, in the International Statistical Institute, we did introduce the idea of universal numeracy for everybody, every adult, that you cannot read and understand any newspaper unless you are numerate, not just literate, but you need to be numerate. And so I appreciate the way you have presented this. So I had one or two minor comments. One has been made, I would like to emphasize it, that if you could kindly present this, and if CPTM could in fact send us a video of the presentation. Images speak better, and the voice speaks louder than a piece of paper. So when a governor, when you get this transmitted to you as an email, you will miss Alan presenting it. If you give it alive to your staff, they appreciate it more. Yeah, that's good. Get a video happening in real time, so they learn more. So my only comment was on how far you can go with the number of dimensions. So you can talk. I must say, I still find the pie chart more appetizing than the higher forms of it. You see, once you have 2 degrees, 2 dimensions present, there are some people who be put off, like the presidential data of France. You see, the simple one is just bar chart, so one got so many. Once you start to talk about migratory votes, which went from where to where there, and then if you could include gender as another 3rd dimension, then some people will get lost. So I don't know whether at FT you are worried about the loss rate of readership once you increase the number of variables. Basically, one has got to watch that one. This is only a comment I have to make. It would be good perhaps to convert the general readership, the whole world, to understand single dimension charts and appreciate them, whether it's a pie chart, a bar chart, or just a simple graph. That would be a good achievement, universally. If that could be understood, then one could build on it as a base. But I thank you very much, and I would start, if I was going to start with anything, I would start with a pie chart. It is more palatable. Thank you.
Again, thank you for those comments. I mean, one thing that I will say about this is there are lots of graph types that we avoid because we think our readers wouldn't be rewarded enough, right? Like, it's not a case of the poster I showed, there's lots of different types of graphics we said we're not going to put on it, right? But we said these are ones that we expect FT readers to see fairly regularly. So with the election chart, well, luckily there were lots of elections in the last 2 years for us to cover. And 2 years ago, we had people saying in editorial meetings exactly what you said. Why can't everything be a pie chart? And then when you go and you put data into a pie chart, you realize just the constraints, as you say, of that's kind of just one variable that we can put in. And there was some research recently that said if you go to 2 variables on a scatter plot, only 66% of Americans will understand that, right? But I think if you'd gone 10 years ago and done the same survey, 40% of Americans, the literacy is building. And actually that can make for much more engaging graphics. So who has seen Hans Rosling's? I know we have Factfulness here. Have you seen Hans Rosling's animated charts? Right? They have 5 variables. So, 12 million people have seen those videos. So, yeah.
I would like to make one point.
I probably will close after that. The graphs and all the vocabulary probably takes in consideration also some analogies or metaphors, although those are not if you come from science or engineering or chemistry. Yeah? I just want to put that in front of you. And I don't want you to discuss about it because I'm sure you'll finish it off. And I'd like to have your view about that. But you see, about a few years ago, we were asked by President of Mozambique, His Excellency President Chissano at that time, to say, what is Smart Partnership Network? My background came from systems analysis, whatever. It happened that Carbon 60 at that time got a Nobel Prize and whatever. And I said, you see, this is not Carbon 60, it's more than 60. This is, so I took with me in my bag, went to Mozambique, and President Chissano said, these are cells, these are networks, these are, yeah? And he said, if we put also a globe in, we have a smart globe. That's Smart Partnership. Now, since 2000, when all of us, we met, you remember, I don't know, Honorable Hausiku, this became the mantra, together with the flag, of Smart Partnership. Now you're trying to explain what is Smart Partnership. Is a kind of analogy, metaphor, I don't know. It's not a graph, but it's a, yeah? And we added to that all sorts of things. I won't take you through that because there is some complexity. I think David will know that, this Lorentz equation, which shows adaptive flexibility, spiraling, and all that. And the one in the middle are this financial inclusion and standards inclusion and quality inclusion, all this network of networks overlapping that evolved within the Smart Partnership in an operative way. So we have a real need for you to try to kind of explain to others what is the value of this Smart Partnership, which evolved, and probably later on Honorable Hausiku will explain in his own way what is Smart Partnership, and you'll pick up some of these vibes. But Christian Petitan, I was asking him to come in and to tell you that since about a year ago, he's from the city. He sent me, I said, what is a taxonomy of cryptocurrencies and all the developments? And he said, the easiest way is look at periodic table. I'll give you a periodic table. Can you explain, Christian, what is that about? And we'll finish with that. I mean, it's not as, can you explain a little bit?
Just another type of graphic using a periodic table values you want to.
I mean, everybody knows a periodic table, a chemistry periodic table.
With different categories, as simple as that. And then you can also use the different elements and the short name to simplify visualization aspects. Yeah, it will be by email.
Just to make a point that there are a lot of developments in the visualization to try to kind of map and cluster the understanding, particularly of the digital developments. And we thank very much to David that about 2 years ago we went to Data Science Institute, and that is where we showed a bit before, when we started this morning, the Bitcoin kind of data visualization. Yeah? So I suppose, Professor Mutabila, now we go into how national statistics, we have Jonathan here, how national statistics is coping with the, yeah? Please.
There is one behind you.
Okay.
So this is B. Go on.
Sorry, I mean,
Yeah, can we go? Yeah.
Fine, so I'm Jonathan Rathel, I'm Deputy National Statistician for Economic Statistics at the Office for National Statistics, and I'll explain a bit about what our role is. Now I'm next with some friends here who are very familiar with our with what we do, and I'll take you through what I'm trying to do today is really take you through the sort of journey we have been on to use new and different sources of data. And some of the opportunities and why we are doing that, but also the challenges that come from these new sources of data, and how we are starting to grapple with them. So I'm just waiting for some slides here. Excellent, great. So we have a sort of a mantra at the Office for National Statistics that we're really about better statistics for better decisions. Yeah. 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 Yeah, and really, well, I think we're interested in decisions because it's not just policies of government. We're also interested in how businesses make decisions. Yeah, okay, business policies, all policies then. So it was really from getting away from just statistics being the output to actually it being policies being the, you know, what we are trying to influence. And that was trying to get away from just being a producer of statistics to thinking more about how do we service everybody in the economy. So for those who don't know us, we are the UK's National Statistical Institute. I cover economic statistics, but we do a whole host of other things. Yeah. Oh, sorry. So we do a whole host of other statistics, whether that's population, migration, crime, lots and lots of other things. We also carry out the census here as well. So that's who we are. And I was really struck by some of the things Alan brought out, that actually some of the challenges we're talking about is not just about how we produce the statistics, but also how we disseminate them. And you know, I think there's so much we can learn from the work of Alan and others. Sometimes we get hung up on words when actually a really good visualization would do us a very good job. But anyway, I've got quite a few words on my slides. So moving on. So who are our users? And just to give you a sort of backdrop, so we do have key policymakers, so the Bank of England, our central bank, the Treasury, our finance ministry. They use our statistics all the time. Businesses, we've done a bit of a survey and find out about 45% of businesses in the UK use some of our statistics. That might be around population, that might be around travel to work out, you know, if they want to put on new bus routes or new transport infrastructure. Lots and lots of people use our data. It's used in virtually everywhere. And the public, we get around 1.2 million visits to the ONS website every month. Now, out of a population in the UK of 65, that's not particularly high, but you know, actually there are quite a few people who are interested in our statistics. And we also get a lot of what we do promoted through the media. And we've got a very vibrant academic community in the UK, many people who access our data for research purposes. So we are, the data we produce and the statistics we produce have a very, very wide reach. And so we are always thinking, or trying to make certain we're always thinking about how we continue to innovate and continue to do things differently. So why did we need to change? And I've got a picture of a report here by a former UK central banker, Professor Sir Charles Bean. And he basically said there are three things that are going on that means that the way you've produced statistics in the past, the way you've provided data, is no longer good enough. Firstly, users' needs are changing. And I'll come on to a bit more of that. But as I said, we've got lots of users. But what they wanted in the past, or what they expected in the past, was quite different to what they expect now. We now live in a world of information at your fingertips. You expect information to be readily available. So I remember I follow football, and I remember, you know, many years ago when I used to go on holiday, if you went on holiday to somewhere like North America where football wasn't very common, if you wanted to find the results, you had to track down a newspaper and find the scores. Now people expect the World Cup to be on their phone there and then. And everything is going in that direction. Decision makers are expecting data that is much more timely, the idea of waiting for months to get a result, that is just no longer where people's expectations are. They see the potential of data, and user needs are really changing quickly. Secondly, the economy around us is changing. So the way we collected data, the variables we reported against, often were based on the economy as it was, not as it is now. So in the UK, the economy has shifted from manufacturing through to services, but we still report huge detail on manufacturing and much less detail on services. The economy is changing in terms of how digital services are enabling the economy, but you won't necessarily see many statistics about that, because we were just not providing the information that people wanted. And lastly, and this is my really the focus of what I want to talk about, is the opportunities from new data sources are immense. While I talk about digital and, do we have digital data in our, from digital ways of fulfilling services in our statistics, those service provision models also give us real insight into, provide data that gives us insight as well. So peer-to-peer services will often generate data which can actually be used. So not only is it a problem in terms of measurement, but it's also an opportunity in terms of data sources. And really, we just needed to keep up with all these things that are going on. So for us, the challenge here was we needed to innovate, or we would risk becoming irrelevant, and we wouldn't be providing the decision makers, the policy makers, with the data that they wanted. So what is some of that change? Well, there are two things. One I've already talked about, which is speed. People wanted, rather than years of waiting for data, they want information at their fingertips now or within days, rather than how we've done it in the past. And also, certainly for the UK, people didn't want just figures for the country. They wanted to know what was going on in a particular industry, a particular manufacturing sector, a particular service sector. They wanted to know what was going on in a particular region, a particular locality. And our statistic, sorry? Yeah, at a particular time. And people, so having figures for the whole country weren't helpful. Decision makers, policy makers wanted to know what was going on locally. And I've already talked about changing, the world is changing. Technology, ever-changing in terms of our needs. Something that's really important for understanding trade is supply chains. We know supply chains often span many countries. Our normal way of reporting trade and understanding trade flows wasn't really good enough for that, when products will cross international boundaries many times before they get to their consumer. And also, one of the things that's going on is certainly we're seeing consumer trends driving really big changes in how goods and services are sold. Online platforms like Amazon, where prices can be changing by the hour, means that some of the ways in which we've gone out to count prices in the past are completely irrelevant now, when there is that regular change. Goods and services are becoming ever more tailored. So you will get a product that is about you. So there isn't a standard product anymore. There are just lots of customized products. So all these things are changing. And if we want to have good economic statistics, we need to make certain we're on top of that. So this is a very simple model of kind of how statistics used to be produced in the past. So most of our data came from surveys. So we would either go out and we would survey businesses, or we would survey households and individuals. We'd ask them, if you're a business, how many of a particular product, how many cars have you produced, how many tires have you produced, how much crude oil have you extracted, those sorts of things. That was what we were asking them. And of households, we were asking them what they were spending, what their sources of income were. Those were the sorts of things we were doing. So we had a survey. We then had to capture all that data. That was time consuming. If people were using paper forms, they would have to be sent back to us. They would have to be entered onto our IT systems, and then we would publish it. And overall, this was a very slow and cumbersome process. And if the survey hadn't been designed with a particular data requirement in it, you didn't get that data. So we couldn't go back after the event and look for different sources of data. If the survey wasn't designed that way, you didn't have the data. And so that was our business model. What we want to do is move to a very different business model, where we will still have surveys. There will still be some things you cannot collect from other data sources. Often these are the sort of attitudinal things that are going on. So we might know somebody is not working, but we don't know why they're not working. Are they not working because they're looking after children? Are they not working because they are ill? Are they not working because they don't think there are any jobs for them to go and find? So some of those things, surveys will still be part of it. But the two new sources are going to be administrative data from government. So government collects huge amounts of information, often through the tax system, about what's going on. Most taxes are levied on transactions, but those transactions are also really relevant for economic statistics, because those transactions are often the things that feed into GDP, those sorts of elements. So administrative data from government is hugely rich. Also, and speaking to central bankers, much of the financial sector generates large amounts of regulatory data in terms of understanding loans, flow of money between different sectors of the economy. So while I say government, we're also interested in working with our colleagues in the central bank to see what is the data they hold about transactions in the economy that could also help us. So that's another promising source. And the other one is private sector data, and this is a bit more untested. I'll come on to give you a couple of examples of where people have started to use it. One is a very good example is using data either collected from internet or from supermarket checkouts and barcodes to understand what people are purchasing and how much they're spending on goods. So you can start from that to then start to think about how you might calculate inflation rates directly from the prices that people are paying, either over the internet or paying in shops. And a couple of national statistical institutes have started to do this, but there are some challenges around that, and I'll come on to those later. And essentially, what we want to do is not just one data source, one output. We want to combine these data sources. So you might have many different data sources. Say on prices, for example, we might get some prices from government, because the government collects data, for example, on fuel prices, those sorts of things. We might get data on prices from shops directly, and we might go out and also still go out into shops or and collect prices manually. But the idea is then, how do we bring that all together? And again, and the output here is not necessarily the statistic. Statistics are great, and it's really important, but actually it's the insight. It's what does this data tell us about the problem you are trying to solve? And it's trying to change that mindset that our job does not finish when the statistics are published. Our job finishes when we've produced the insight that helps people, policymakers or whoever, make those policies and decisions. And the other aspect to this is we want also to recognise that once we've got this valuable data, how do we make it available to others? Because we are not going to be the only ones who want to work with this data. There will be a whole academic community out there trying to access and use this data. So really, that's our sort of summary of our plan for the future. What are the challenges? Well, new data means new skills. We had, and we still have, a lot of expertise around how you put together surveys, how you construct them in a way that means we get good responses. We've got lots of expertise there. But these new data sources are vast. They require different analytical, mathematical skills. So you need to make certain you have the data providers, the data analysis skills that means that the data provided can be actually used. And this is a headline from the Financial Times about talking about something we had launched last year, which is a data science campus. So this allows us to bring in a wide variety of people, often not necessarily with statistical backgrounds. It can be mathematical backgrounds, science backgrounds, who have the skills to analyze large data sets. And for example, one of the rich sources of these new skills are sometimes particle physicists. Particle physicists are used to very large data sets, and some of the data we'll be bringing in is very, very large, and they make great data scientists. So new skills is really an important part of that. I'm not saying we've cracked that, and I'm pretty certain everybody in this room finds it difficult to recruit people with really strong analytical skills. This is, I think there's a worldwide shortage of these people, so it is a challenge. But you need to think about how do you invest in building those skills. So the other one is then about protecting data, and this is really important. Again, different countries will have different legal contexts or different social attitudes to sharing data. But for us, it's really important that if we get data from the public, if we get data from businesses, they are confident that that data will not be misused. It will not go into the hands of their competitors if you're a business, or if you're an individual, into the hands of people who might try and con you or do something else. So by law, we can only work on statistics and research. We are not interested in targeting people or targeting businesses. We think that's really important for reassuring people that if we get this data from government or from the private sector, it will be properly used. We already get a lot of this data. So as I said, we run the census in the UK. We've run it for 200 years. And in that time, we've never had a problem with our data being misused. So we've got a track record of doing that. So we hope it's really, really important. But you cannot underestimate the importance of good data protection in terms of being able to use this data and people confidently providing it to you. So a really important part, if you're going to get into these new data sources, think about the data security and the issues around protecting that data. The other issue is working with data suppliers. So in the future, we have public sector data suppliers, we will have private sector data suppliers, and a few very, very quick thoughts on this. Firstly, you have to remember that the data was not collected for a statistical purpose. The data was collected to help the administration of the tax system, the administration of the benefit system, or the health service, or whatever it was. It was not designed to answer your specific question. So you really have to understand, you can't necessarily take at face value, therefore, what the data labels say it is. You really have to understand the data. It might have some quirks in it. There might be certain categories of the population who are not there for whatever reason. You have to understand that and really work with people on that. And that really leads on to my second point, that it's not good enough just to have the data itself. You need to have the relationships with the people, that if you spot something strange in the data, there's somebody you can pick up on the phone, you can phone up and say, why is this data like this? Help me understand this. Help me understand this data. We would sort of summarize this as the sort of metadata, but actually it's really, really important in terms of just that understanding of the data. And certainly in the UK, the need for confidentiality is really very important. And government providers of data, whether that's the tax department, will not let that data out until they are reassured we have the same level of security, if not more, that they apply to that data in their own environment. So anchoring this in protecting the data is really, really important. Private sector, as I said, that's less developed. You go around the world, you find lots of countries that are using government data, but private sector data is the next thing I think many people are thinking about. And it's really quite interesting to talk to companies about this. Many companies have not thought about why we might be interested in their data. They're not really in the mindset of understanding why a National Statistical Institute wants their data. That's just not on their radar. So you have to again spend some time understanding what the commercial interests are. For some companies, this data is really, really valuable to them. They will be very reluctant to provide it to you for free unless they really understand what you are trying to do and why. And I think the other aspect is getting a reliable supply. You know, government in one form or another is always likely to be there. Taxes are always likely to be there in one form or another. So that is probably a pretty firm supply of data. But companies come and go. And if you invest in a particular company for a particular supply of data and that company goes bust or something happens to it, you are then exposed. So these are the challenges you need to think about. And also, as I said, one of the other things here is cost. Often, certainly with commercial organisations, there is a cost around it. We've now got some legislation that allows us essentially to ask for that data for free, but we need to think quite carefully about how we get that ongoing relationship. Because again, just them sending through the data without the understanding of that data is not going to get us very far. So this is the sort of journey we're on. These are the sorts of issues that actually many national statistical institutes around the world are dealing with. Some have got further down this path than others, and in some cases it will be easier in some countries than others to make this work. Partnerships. I think the issue here, and I'm glad we have one of our partners with us, is that you are not going to solve this by yourself. If we as a National Statistical Institute said we knew we had all the answers, you know, that would be an illusion. The tools and techniques to use these new complex data sources are not ones we're going to master on our own. We need cutting edge tools and techniques to do this. And so one of the things we've done, and Rebecca is here who's director of the Economic Statistics Centre of Excellence, we set up a Centre of Excellence which was a partnership with academics who can help us. They've got skills and expertise and knowledge we do not have. If we're going to use these new data sources, we need them to help us to develop these insights. And I think something else we've also invested a lot of time is learning from other statistical institutes. We've, for example, recently used VAT or sales tax data in our national accounts, and we were able to learn from the experience in the Netherlands about how they did it. We're all basically trying to solve a lot of the same questions. We can learn a lot from each other. Lots of the issues here are quite common. Some of them will be very bespoke to the particular issues, but there's a lot of commonality in this. And so creating strong partnerships, recognizing that you are going to sometimes say, I don't know how to answer this. How do you create that network of people around you, that network of organizations that's able to meet that challenge? So just a quick summary. Our users, our policymakers want a wide variety of new data and statistics. What we are doing in the past is not going to be good enough for the future. New data and new tools are out there. The question is how best to use them. I think we've got to take advantage of it. Otherwise, we become irrelevant, and in time we will. Will we exist if we do not embrace some of the new opportunities? But it's not easy and straightforward to do this. I talked about data privacy, about how you work with data partners, the skills and expertise you need. These are all challenges, but I think they need to be faced. We need to think about how we get on with them. Basically, my message here is the prize here is absolutely massive. If we can get this right, we can provide insight and expertise that will really help people, certainly here, to make those better decisions we're hoping to get going. So I hope that's helpful in terms of sort of setting out some of the high-level issues and messages as we see them. So thank you very much.
Any
Yeah,
questions?
I think probably, yeah. Governor Majosi, do you have
Comments?
interactions with national statistics?
Yes,
But I thought the governor would go first.
Yeah, the governor, yeah? Or Adam?
No, Professor.
Professor.
Thank you very much. It's very interesting direction. I'll give my question simple. I'll talk to you later. I want to be technical. The dilemma which is coming up, mine is a broad question about how you measure national wealth. Oh, it's next. But economic, since he's here, economic statistics is a major source. Actually, that's what it is. That's what you use to measure the wealth of your nation. And the biggest challenge to me for the future of the statistical office is how to deal with the invisible man. Who wrote that novel? The Invisible Man. I read it a long time ago. HGS, what is yours? Or so you're at the table and somebody comes, eats the food, and the plate is empty, but you don't know who has eaten it. And you don't know how much more he's going to eat. So the challenge to me, and Jonathan knows this, when we are doing trade statistics like in Uganda and especially in Africa where borders are porous, we try to estimate unrecorded trade and things like that. And now the danger, well, which normally comes out below around 10% using different methods. I think the danger is that that percentage is likely to increase. In fact, it could go as high as 90%. The ratio could be reversed. Then how reliable are these figures going to be if the traders are invisible, invisible people? Moses, he's not here, from Tanzania. You are there, yes. You were telling me last night, some people, I won't mention the company, from the East went to Tanzania and started dealing in Bitcoins and things like that. Somebody invested $5,000 within 8 months. He had collected $50,000. In essence, in terms of Adam Smith, what has he done? I mean, where is this wealth coming from? How do you take that into account when you are computing the wealth of Tanzania as a nation? I think this is going to be the challenge of the future. If you could say a bit more about that. To deal with the invisible actors in the economy, and they may not even be British, they may be elsewhere. How are you going to take them into account? It's the biggest challenge, and it's what we are dealing with in this think tanking, basically. It is technological impact on traditional methods of one, conceptualization of national statistics, and two, the reliability and the use to which can be put, and to what extent they remain valid, and to what extent they will become invalid. I would like some comment on that. I hope I've spoken for everybody in this respect. Or at least on this subject of invisibility, yeah, the invisible actors.
So I think that's a really powerful point, and I think that will play out differently in different countries. But sometimes what will help here is some of those wider data sources. So if I was interested in sort of understanding, has the trade, this undeclared trade between Uganda and Tanzania gone up, I might be really interested in getting mobile phone data and saying how many mobile phone calls or text messages have been exchanged between Uganda and Tanzania. Now that might be a way of understanding, well actually, are there other data sources here? So as I said, sometimes you won't be able to directly measure what we're interested in, but there will be other data sets that might well have variables that correlate with what you're interested in. So actually, and that is part of the digital, some of these digital data sets, that sometimes you'll be able to infer things from looking at other measures that are are there. But I think it will always be challenging, and I think it's becoming increasingly complex. We know that sometimes for tax purposes, companies will locate in a particular territory or particular activity. That is becoming more and more complex. I think it's also then how do we cooperate across, and I think one of the things we've not really worked out as National Statistical Institutes is how do we cooperate across. We might have some data on our side that helps a country over there to better understand its economy. You know, it's a bit like we all have part of the jigsaw here, and I sometimes think is how do we then bring that together. So for me, some of the answers will be in some of the other data sources. The non-traditional data sources might well help us. And I also think it's then about how do we work across borders. Now that's very challenging because, as I said, companies provide us with data on the understanding it never leaves the ONS. So how do we then have a conversation with our counterpart in Uganda or another country that allows us to have that? But those are the challenges I think we have to face, because otherwise we will all find that our economies are increasingly, you know, being eaten by the invisible man. So.
No, I just wanted a bit more attention, because this is what I understood from national statistic offices, your colleagues. Yeah. Obviously they feel, national statistic offices, that they have a new role, particularly when central banks, for instance, governors, they could, in principle, have their own statistics real time. Just take the mobile banking that they are kind of getting into, and they have data without necessarily coming to national statistics, and they could have analysis. In the morning there was a data analytical representative here, or visualization. So I suppose you respond, the National Statistics Office responds to that. But also, before we go to nature of the new type of statistics because of the data campus that you are experimenting with, yeah? It may be that exactly as Bank of England is experimenting with having little hubs and little units on data visualization, national statistic offices could experiment with data campus, because I don't think it was picked up that aspect of it. It's a particular.
So I think the something I didn't talk about, but actually one of the biggest prizes here is not just necessarily the individual data sets them together, but then linking them up. So you might have the data on the transactions, on the internet transactions, but we hold the census. So we can then map that to the characteristics of the people involved. You know, what levels of education have they got? What are they working? So sometimes, and I think what we see ourselves as a National Statistical Institute is we won't have all the data ourselves, but sometimes we can tie together those different data sets in a way that an individual, a central bank couldn't. We will have some data from, you know, from trade. We can then match that to the companies. There's lots and lots of these linkages. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, indeed. So I think there is an element of that. I also think we're only at the start of this, and I don't know what the final model will be. I also think it's important we allow innovation. So I really welcome the work, certainly in the UK, that is done by the Bank of England. You know, they do some really, really innovative work, and it's a bit of a, you know, this is there is no single way of doing this. I think the more ideas and the more innovation we get in this space, generally the better. So I'm very optimistic about this, and I think many national statistical institutes are now thinking, wherever you are in a developed country or a lesser developed country, you are thinking about kind of how do you position yourself to help to help people. And sometimes that might be joining people up, but it's not always about, as I said, it's getting away from this idea that we are the only players in town. We're the only ones who do these surveys and have the knowledge. We need to recognise we're now part of a wider system.
In New Zealand and wherever else,
Yeah.
Privatizing, where is it?
Well, no. So no, so I've not really seen. I mean, there is a real challenge here about what is our role in the future. Is do we become this sort of data hub? Yeah, and I think that becomes quite difficult. I don't think anybody's really. Everyone's starting to think about those questions, but nobody's really worked out what the answer is for the future. The other aspect we try not to get into is being a commercial. We don't want to displace commercial activity. We're thinking about where do we add value that the private sector couldn't. So there's lots and lots of these challenges to think about your role. But it's and I don't think anybody has quite worked out what the end state is yet.
Thank you. I had a chat with a telecommunication company back at home, and the gentleman told me that, you know what, for us, we don't look at your national statistics about GDP, simply because if I want to know how the economic activity is going, I just look at how people are buying airtime and putting on their phone. So he said to me that is a good measure of how economic activity is really booming. So I thought that was very innovative. Now, when you are merging different data sources, how do you ensure the quality? Because now we're talking about public, private, and we're trying to merge them. Because coming from part of our world, for example, if I get data from, say, Ministry of Education, how do I ensure that what they have reported there is in terms of quality, the standards are really are made. I think that's where what I have seen in the case of Uganda. That's where we have a bit of challenge. In your case, how do we ensure that actually the standards are met by the suppliers of the data before you try to aggregate?
So, I think that's a really good question, and I think it. I'll start off by saying that the way we've thought about quality in the past needs to change. And again, this is when you were doing everything on surveys, you had a framework for what quality is. Quality could be measured in terms of sampling variation, confidence intervals, all those sorts of things. You could test the questions to work out whether people were responding. I think quality now becomes a much less well-defined issue, and you have to start thinking more about how do you quality, and sometimes it's a judgment. How do you judge different data sources? And sometimes you will just look at them and look at how they are collected and think, okay, that's fine. So the good thing about tax data is that there is a whole compliance framework behind it. That if you write down an income, your income, everybody knows the taxman might come calling and tell you to justify that. So that encourages people to put the right things down. Sometimes there isn't that compliance, and then you might really think about whether, do I really want to put much weight on that if there isn't those compliance checks, if it isn't core to my tax. So I think you have to think quite carefully about it. And you have to then just take you essentially judge your individual data sources in a much more qualitative way. But I think you then look at how does this, the key thing is, does this stack up? And I come from an economics background, and economics does give you then some tools. Do you find the relationships you would find? Do you find government assets are safer than private sector assets? There are some tests you can then do to think, well, actually, does this tell an economically coherent story? So I think it's those sorts of things you then have to lay on. And also, if you've worked with data, sometimes this sounds a bit, sometimes you get a gut feel for what is good and what isn't. And so sometimes it's about just working with that data. Does it pass, some simple tests? But I think that quality point is a very good one. Is one we've grappled with, and David Hand has written papers on about how we might the challenges there. But there is no single framework anymore. That is undoubtedly true. So it becomes a much more nuanced story.
So I suppose.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah. We'll need to go to.
Thank you very much. It's not a question that I'm going to make to ask, but it's a general remark. Yes. Yes. Well, Boniface is from. Boniface from Cameroon, and I work in the office of the president and also give lectures in the university. And I'm looking at, I just want to make a general remark from a pedagogic point of view. The point of departure for me is just to refresh our minds that CPTM was created in 1995 with a unique mandate of making new technologies available to member countries of the Commonwealth. And I have attended conferences everywhere, all over, and I think this is a unique body that we have. If we look at the UN system, there are other institutions, but there is none which is meant to make member countries benefit from evolving technology. We all know that technology is the only factor that decides who has to be rich or poor. And so I just want to think that, to remark that this is a very good exercise. And the presentations of today have been particularly very, very interesting, because I've been attending CPTM meetings for for the past 10 years. Yes, for how many years? Well, I don't know. Well, you have better records. So I think I'm very, very appreciative of the presentations made today. The issues are very interesting, and the presentations are clear. And particularly, as we talked with Mihaela, the whole issue is not for us to come here and sit and then lecture and then go home. There is the most important thing here is what is the take home. For Cameroon, the governor of the central bank was supposed to be here. The director of national statistics was supposed to be here, and the general Sanders, yes, was supposed to be here. But for reasons which I explained to Mihaela, I think visa complications are so they couldn't come. But what I'm trying to say is that this unique session is very, very good, because at least we have the written documents here, and I'm addressing this particularly to Mihaela. No, that's where you've not got. You have not understood. You have not understood. You have not understood me. That's why I'm calling your attention to what I want to say. I'm saying that the key thing for us, as I said last time, is take home. What do we take home now for the development of our countries? Now, the good thing is that the different officials who made presentation, at least they have a document here, which even though these other institutions could not attend, they can exploit this. So, yeah. So we are very. I just wanted to make this appreciation, and that in future, Mihaela, we talked about this. This should be very, very important. Anybody who makes a presentation should make a document so that we can take home, and then it can be exploited by various government agencies or public sector, private sector. Well, people like questions. Let me just ask one question. Sorry. No, this is a question pertinent to this. I was making a remark, but now it's a question. Yes, I think for us to understand clearly the dynamics of the presentation, I want one of the presenters to make a distinction between data and statistics. This is very, very important. Thank you.
Yeah, so I mean, I think for us, yeah, data is the underlying material we work with. It's useful to produce the statistics, but increasingly it's useful in itself, and people want to get into the detail of it. So I think it's, for us, you know, data is the raw material we are now working with. Statistics is no longer the only thing we produce. Is making that data available to others in a controlled environment is itself an end now. So it's very difficult to get people to understand. And here is where Alan Smith probably comes in. Yeah. The difference to make people to understand that. Indeed. What's the difference between statistics and data? And in some ways, actually, I don't want people to really understand it. I want people to get the insight from the data or the statistics that helps them to make those better policies we talked about. I suppose one way of also explaining that is that because of data, available data and the
Insights of the data, there are new type of measuring economy that is coming about, which is the experience that you started to have with the new center.
Now,
Rebecca.
Our last
Rebecca to comment.
last contribution from Rebecca.
Rebecca, you didn't know what to expect now.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me. I'm the director of the Economic Statistics Center of Excellence, which is a very new research center, which, sorry? A year and a half, I guess we're coming up to it. Yes, so very new. And Mihaela has asked me to speak very briefly about some of the issues that digitization brings to economic measurement. And I'm afraid I was also instructed not to have slides, so I apologize very much for not having a document to send to you, but we do have lots of evidence on our website, and I can direct you to those materials if indeed you are interested. So I'll try and give you a sense of what digitization means for economic measurement and some of the things we're doing, and why it's such an exciting time to be looking at economic statistics. And I would definitely agree with Alan that economic statistics are everything but boring. So now I would like to start by saying that how important economic statistics actually are. So economic statistics are our way of describing the economy. So of course, if we're going to be able to conduct any economic policy, we need to be able to describe the economy that we're trying to conduct policy about. Now, obviously, I was going to say that, and I assume that you agree and that's I'm preaching to the converted here. But I wanted to give you an example, a small illustrative example of just how important economic statistics really are. So I'm going to take you back 10 years in time to 2008. And as you will recall from that time, we had a global financial crisis. And I want you to think about what it would be like to be a central banker at that time. Now, in the UK, we have a monetary policy committee which votes about interest rates and monetary policy, conducts monetary policy generally. Back in 2008, the situation that we had was one where there were some indicators that were showing that the economy was starting to slow down a bit. Now, one of the very important pieces of information that monetary policy makers look at is, of course, GDP. And so GDP is like a summary statistic, very, very important statistic. Now, in July 2008, the interest rate was about 5%, and the MPC decided to keep interest rates at 5%. The information they had about GDP at the time, obviously they look at many other indicators as well, was that GDP had risen by about 0.2% in that quarter. And as we moved on over time, 3 months later, they did cut interest rates by 0.5 point. What the evidence was showing then was that GDP had shrunk by 0.5%. So that was the information that we had. What we know now is that actually, in July, when we thought the economy had expanded by 0.2%, it had actually contracted by 0.7%. That's quite a big contraction. And when 3 months later, we thought that the economy had contracted, but only by 0.5 point, 0.5 point's still a lot, it had actually contracted by 1.7%. So it seems reasonable to, and of course we know what happened after that initial period. It became very clear that we were in a full-blown recession. The interest rate was cut very, very drastically, and there was we embarked on this program of quantitative easing. Now, had policymakers had the information, the accurate information, more quickly, it seems reasonable to assume that they would have made some different decisions. I mean, maybe they wouldn't have. Maybe they had a whole series of statistics and they knew exactly what they were doing. But one can at least speculate that had they had this information that we have now more quickly, they may have cut interest rates more quickly. What does that do to the economy? Well, of course, we may have had a less deep recession. Maybe some jobs wouldn't have been lost that were lost. So that's a little illustration of how important economic statistics are, how important quick accurate economic statistics are. So, Jonathan's points in the past presentation, it's quite clear that big data, new forms of data, are absolutely crucial to conducting economic policy because they're going to allow us to have that information in something that looks like real time. So, for example, the ONS is working with administrative data, company tax returns, VAT returns. This information can be combined and put together to turn into something that looks like GDP. That's exactly what's going on. There's data on the internet that we can pull off the internet. There's transactions data, huge data sets that mean that we can actually monitor the economy in real time, essentially. All of these data can be put together and put into estimates of what's happening in the economy. So the gains from digitization seem pretty clear. That's just one little example. And we can also quantify for that one little example what, having that data more quickly could mean if, we were in a situation where the economy's changing. Let's say the economy starts to slow down again. How important is it purely in sort of jobs terms, monetary terms, to have that data quickly? Well, we can try and guess at that by thinking back to 2008 and formulating a different economic policy. We can look at what the data looks like now, what we know happened, and we can sort of try and guess at what the MPC might have done. And if we do that, of course, we get a faster interest rate cut, and we can run that through an economic model, and that can then give us an idea of the benefits purely in sort of monetary terms and jobs terms. And of course, these are not small benefits. They are small relative to the economy as a whole, but they're not small. So, there are clear benefits of digitization to the production of economic statistics and therefore to policy making. But also, digitization raises a number of issues for economic measurement. So there's these benefits. It also gives us a little bit of a headache because what we're trying to describe, the economy that we're trying to describe, is changing. And it's changing in such ways that our economic statistics may no longer be reflecting exactly what we think it's supposed to be reflecting. So I want to just talk you through some of the changes that digitization has brought to the economy and therefore to economic statistics. So let's start by thinking about how things are produced. Now, if you produce a chair or a table or piece of furniture, obviously you use various components to produce this, but you also use a designer. You are also, maybe you are IKEA, you have invested in a huge logistics system. There's all sorts of branding that goes with that. And these are things that we call intangibles. They're intangible inputs into production. They're also outputs. They're also investments. So they are things that we've actually produced. They're not necessarily counted in our standard statistics. So we may not have counted our investment in a nice logistics system. It may not appear as investment in GDP and therefore get added to GDP. So, the way that things are produced, these sort of intangible inputs into production, these types of investment, probably mean that there's a lot of things that we are missing. And it's very interesting that the latest appointment to the Monetary Policy Committee is a world-leading expert on exactly this issue and how to measure intangibles and the importance of these intangibles in actually determining the path of the economy. Another issue that digitization raises, so and also if we think about what are these intangibles, like branding and design and logistics systems, etc., software systems. Data itself is another intangible. So, we're always collecting databases. Do we actually count the value of these databases? Are we measuring the investments in these databases? When we're trying to understand the capacity of the economy, are we taking into account all of these things that we have? Another issue that arises with digitization is globalization. Now, globalization has been going on for a very long time, helped by the decreasing cost of transport, for example, but also affected by digitization itself. Information can flow across the world. We can have production in one place, talking to production in another place. So, that process, digitization has really accelerated that process, I think. Now, a lot of production is therefore not really happening in one country. It's happening across several countries to produce one thing, you may be having production in many countries at the same time, in the same company or in some other legal construct. And so that is actually quite difficult for trying to actually measure what's happening in this economy. So if we think about when we're deriving economic statistics and you're a central bank, you're trying to conduct policy that reflects what's happening to the economy in the country that you're in, well, now the country is increasingly a region in a world economy. And the borders are less well. Borders are really useful for economic statistics because they capture changes. You can see transactions across borders. You don't see them within a country necessarily, how they move across different parts of the country. We have the typical example of the iPhone. The iPhone is often assembled, produced in China, and then imported to the United States or some other country in Europe. But actually, to produce that iPhone, there was also an export to China in the form of a design. So this is back to those intangibles. That doesn't necessarily get captured in the trade data or the GDP data, right? So this global production, the use of intangibles in production, they blur the lines of what we're trying to measure quite significantly. And so that's another issue that comes up with digitization. Another headache for economic statistics that arises with digitization is the concept of the production boundary. Now, this is something that Diane Coyle has written a lot about. So usually GDP is, GDP was designed to measure market transactions. And what's happened with digitization is that some of those activities that were captured in GDP are no longer taking place in the market. They've moved outside of the market. And so we may have, GDP may be tracking a different set of activities than it was previously. So, the typical example here is the one of the travel agent. We used to have travel agents. I think we may still have some, but we're our own travel agents. We look on the internet, we sort things out. It's not difficult because of what's available online. You can do this yourself. All forms of search activity can take place online. We used to buy encyclopedias. People used to produce stuff for encyclopedias. Now you have Wikipedia you can look at online, and there's people are producing software, putting it online. So there's activities that are moving out of the marketplace and that are available online. We have households acting as producers. They are operating in the gig economy. Maybe we count that, maybe we don't. Not always clear. They're using their own capital in production. So that market economy, the household boundary, the market boundary, those things they're not changing, but what's on each side of those boundaries is changing. And so that means when we're trying to track what's going on in the economy, it's possible that our main measure, GDP, is tracking something different over time. And so, we need to be aware of how important these activities are, what that means for these statistics that were used to describe what's going on. Another issue with digitization is the concept of free goods. So of course, if something's free, it's not going to be counted in an expenditure. So I already mentioned Wikipedia, it's free, so I don't need to go out and buy an encyclopedia, not that I necessarily would have done anyway, but there's a lot of things that you would have spent your money on in the past which are now freely available online. And when things are free, they don't get counted. Here there's another set of issues which arise, the issue of welfare arises. So, it's okay in some way if we don't count things that we don't spend our money on. But it might mean that there's an increasing disparity between the value that we get as consumers from the various things that we consume and what's actually recorded here in GDP. That's not necessarily a problem for a central bank, but it does raise another set of interesting issues. The final point I wanted to just mention in relation to the digital economy and economic statistics was around the measures of price. So we have a very interesting example here in the UK. You may be aware that in the UK we have had a very, very sharp slowdown in productivity growth. In fact, productivity, the amount of output produced per head, has, over the past many years risen by about 2% a year or something. It hasn't moved at all for the last decade. And if we try and look at why that is, there's a whole series of answers you could offer to that. There's not a single answer. But if we look at where in the economy productivity has slowed down, we can say it has slowed down in many places, lots of different sectors of the economy. But very interestingly, productivity growth has really fallen sharply in telecoms, the telecom sector, the information and communication sector. Now, just sort of that doesn't seem right? We know how much technological development there's been in the last decade, so it doesn't feel right, I guess. This is the gut instinct about statistics. It doesn't feel right that there should have been such a sharp slowdown in productivity growth in this sector, where we've had the development of broadband and we all have our smartphones, etc. So the interesting thing then is that if we look at what's happened to prices in that sector, they look like they've been relatively flat for a long time. But you might say that, well, if I pay the same price for my phone now that I did 10 years ago, well, my phone has become so much more, it does everything. We can't live without our phones anymore. It's become a tool, it has a camera, it has a map, we can go anywhere, we won't get lost. Lots of value in this phone. So in a way, we should be thinking that prices have actually fallen, because what we're getting for that same amount of money is so much better. So if we do try and quality adjust prices to take into account these changes in what we're actually getting for the same nominal amount of money, it seems quite possible that productivity growth would look rather different in this particular sector. How that then affects GDP is a separate issue. But again, it's a digitization issue. It's related to that. Do we count the quality of what we're getting well enough? Do we therefore count growth well enough? So I guess, yes, there are lots of opportunities with digitization for the production of economic statistics. We've already heard about that. But it also raises a whole series of challenges for economic measurement. And of course, this is really important. Anybody who's interested in tracking what's happening to the economy has to have some view about these developments, needs to take these developments seriously and think about what they actually mean for the data that we're observing or the statistics that we're producing. So if you're a central bank, how am I going to gauge the production capacity, the production potential of this economy? I need to know about all those inputs and outputs. I need to understand what growth is really doing. How much spare capacity do we have in the economy? In the UK, employment has continued to rise very strongly, but output hasn't quite matched it. As I say, productivity has slowed down very much. So to answer those questions about, to conduct the right policy, to answer the questions about how is the economy moving, we need to be thinking about how all of these digital issues affect the statistics we produce. Yeah? Okay.
I think if you thought that you got easy simply going into crypto and all that, you probably didn't really realize of the hidden impact in relation to the way you measure the invasion of the national economies and so on, of the cryptocurrencies and so on. So this is simply an insight to show you how the national statistic offices who are forming within the SMART partnership their own group, they feel very threatened by the fact that governors, central banks, seem to like the digital currencies which are coming in, or try to understand how that will be brought in with legal frameworks and everything else. But at the same time, the national statistical offices are actually having a very big role to measure the kind of impact these cryptocurrencies might or might not make if they are adopted. And one other thing, we have two other issues. In fact, one more. Jonathan mentioned a number of times of data suppliers, and we all mention about, oh, there are data centers or whatever. Now, I don't think that the so-called digital infrastructure, both for central banks as well as for national statistics and National Bureau of Standards, who are involved into this because of their own input into blockchain technology standard. I don't think that the issue of digital infrastructure can be left aside. And we just brought in, before David, Professor David Hand, is going to make an overall kind of comment again on where we are with and which are the signals for the future with the data science and data as a whole, data revolution, so to speak. There is in Manchester, where could you say a very few words about you just beginning to develop one of the data centers, which are? Can you explain a little bit? Not too long.
No, I won't take up.
Because we are not going to talk.
Oh, do you want me to stand there? Yeah, of course. No, of course I'm aware of the time, so I'll make sure to keep it brief. But before I came, I discussed with some of our research infrastructure team, just so we can get some information, just so you guys can be aware of some things that we've learned at Manchester, which might be of use for you to just take note of. You know, nothing that you need to do, but just some things that might be of concern or things for you to think about. But things that we learnt in Manchester was that it's important to obviously know the capacity of the data center that you'll need. And this is I'm talking about pure hardware at the moment, you know, and the capacity you need, and this kind of capacities is according to our research team usually measured in electrical output. So you'd have to think about how much electricity you can actually spare to power these things, as 100 servers running 350 watts each is 35 kilowatts, and that's a small server farm, where our data centers at Manchester are much bigger than this. So then that's something to take note of. Another two other key things then to take note of is obviously location and the cooling aspects of things like this, where obviously somewhere that's in a cold country, it's much, it might be okay just to have a fan from the outside if it's cold outside, it will simply just cool the servers. But in hot countries, obviously talking to countries from Africa here, you'd be well aware, but you obviously need a lot of air conditioning to be able to cool these servers down. And then one final thing is the network and the speed of these things. Whereas you'd be likely looking at speeds or networks of multiples of 10 gigabits, our data centers in Manchester are a minimum of 80 gigabits per second. So that's just something to take note of. But one final thing as well is obviously with data centers in Office of National Statistics and in other places across the UK, it's not just purely about hardware, it's about the people that they are running and doing the work as well. And what we found very important in Manchester is to not only have people who would do the research and the work and the hard work on the say if we're talking about obviously fintech and stuff like that, not the people who are purely working on the analysis of the data on fintech, but also the social sciences aspects. We found to bring those people on board is also a very good aspect to do, as that gives you the wider aspects and the wider impact of the work that you're doing to the local people and things like that. So that kind of research will then, you'll get an idea of the of what kind of trust levels the the public and things like that will have on any potential new technologies that you might be developing or any type of new research that you're conducting. And that's one of the main parts, unless you want me to keep.
Colleague with Pumbu, the other day, about in Namibia, for instance, are there many, or is there aware about data centers in Namibia? And it wasn't very clear if there are data centers are part of government or university, or data centers which probably may exist and nobody knows about it within private sector. And he said, no, I'm not aware, but I'll let you know. You made me curious. And I said, I will let you know. I'll find from our own network. And of course, usually I go to Moses, who knows everything on the spot, and you find out that there are actually data centers from private sector who are interested in Namibia. Airbus has one. There is a space associated observatory which has one. And where are they? They are in University of Namibia, but they are not connected with the or used, or the capability with the actually mainstream of the central banks or whatever. Last night we were together, yesterday afternoon, and we were discussing with Honourable Minister yesterday morning and then again. And we try to see if supercomputers make any difference, if there is one, for a data center or a data capability. Do you have high-performance computer access to?
Yes, Manchester. We
Yeah.
do. It's part of some research done in our School of Computer Science. Does involve a number of high-performance computing. Especially with our research group, which has developed a number of special microchips and things like that. You might have heard of some of the, like the ARM microchip that was developed by co-developed by Steve Ferber, who runs one of the research groups at Manchester, and that in those. And the School of Computer Science led by, well, the School of Computer Science isn't led by this research team, but the research team within the School of Computer Science is leading our work on high performance computing. So those kind of things are at Manchester. One thing as well is, even though, as you say, like there are data centers at universities and things like that. One thing, one of our data centers at Manchester is in collaboration with a commercial bank. I don't know if I'm at liberty to discuss say who it is, but it is with a commercial bank. So then. Yeah, but one of those things is to say, like in a private sector, even though it is a private sector data center, it is housed within the university. So then that is something to also take note of.
Make a comment, but they do have in University of Lesotho a supercomputer. So the question would be, could they develop a data center? Could they develop a... They are also very cool. It's very cool in Lesotho. There's a lot of electricity is on tap. Yeah. So could they attract a data farm, a data mining farm in Lesotho, or what? Things of that nature.
It's technically possible, yes. From what my discussions with our research infrastructure team, it's just the case of the capability and how much you're willing to put into it to get it to do what you need it to do. Because you could have a data center, but maybe it's not powerful enough or thing to run the work that you need it to do. But obviously, if you have got a supercomputer, then that might be a moot point. But then, of course, the things that the things I've discussed at the beginning is also there is also the the workforce needed to obviously run these things as well, you know, the system administrators and things like that. As long as you have those kind of things and you have the supercomputer or something like that, then it would be possible to have it in your own universities or own countries.